It's truly incredible how athletes have gone from being told to shut up and dribble to now holding immense power to speak out on issues of injustice, tell their own stories, and even profit off their own name, image, and likeness while playing in the National Collegiate Athletic Association. From Colin Kaepernick and Megan Rapinoe taking a knee, to the entire WNBA being ahead of the curve and using their platforms to speak out, athletes are standing up for what they believe in and changing the conversation on what they can be involved in outside their sport. More specifically, and especially notable to me as a student athlete myself, the mental health conversation revolving around athletics has made great strides. Michael Phelps opens up about his post-Olympic depression and suicidal thoughts. Naomi Osaka is transparent about her mental health battles throughout her tennis career. Victoria Garrick, former USC volleyball player, has built a platform off of having real body image conversations. The scene around athlete mental health is changing, and not just for the sake of our professional or Olympic athletes, but for the sake of our semi-pro, collegiate, and even high school athletes as well. The stigma that athletics culture has created around mental health is not going to change overnight, and it's going to take consistent, intentional vulnerability to break down toxic stereotypes reinforced through social media and the ideology of what it means to be mentally tough. But more on that in a second. My name is Brenna Murray, and I play Division I soccer at UNC Charlotte, where I'm also our two-time Student Athlete Advisory Committee, or SAC, president. If you don't know what SAC is, it's basically like student athlete, student government, and our voice in the athletic department. I also currently serve as the Conference USA SAC chair and have been a member of the Conference SAC for 3 years, while also serving as Conference USA's secondary Division I national SAC rep for 2. I'm largely responsible for the creation of Charlotte's Greater Than the Game platform, which focuses on student-athlete mental health and self-compassion. To say that I'm passionate about elevating athlete voices is an understatement. But long before I did any of this, like many other athletes, I struggled with how my own mental health journey fit in with my sport. I simply couldn't figure out how soccer and my performance anxiety were supposed to coexist. I couldn't figure out how my grief and depression in high school were supposed to just not impact my performance. But most of all, I couldn't figure out how to ask for help when I needed it the most. For as long as I can remember, I've always dealt with some level of anxiety in my life. When I was in elementary school, I was already learning about mindfulness and yoga and practicing breathing exercises. I carried little trinkets with me to ease what felt like my mind's endless racing, and I eventually learned to calm and cope with my childhood irrational fears. Nowadays, performance anxiety is the demon in the corner that likes to hang around. I've had coaches tell me to just get over it and to stop looking like a deer in headlights. But it's truly hard to describe how small you can feel in the moments before you step on that field and how hard it can be to get out of your head and into the game. I know this is a common feeling. As a college athlete, you are so young and there is so much pressure. As a goalkeeper, I'm quite familiar with living in the pressure cooker that became my most important identity. As the person who has to pick up the ball out of the back of the net when mistakes are made and act as the last line of defense at all times, the pressure is constant. Therefore, mental toughness is certainly something I've had to develop to become an elite athlete at the level I am now. But I think athletics culture struggles to define the difference between needed mental toughness and mental health. When is enough enough? When can you push yourself harder? And when does it become an issue that all you can do when you get home from practice every day is lay on the floor and stare at the ceiling for hours? We have a generation of athletes who are now, more than ever, starting to loudly ask these questions. But for me, the real reason that I'm so passionate about mental health and the revolving conversations is much more personal. October 4th, 2016 was supposed to be a completely normal day. And it was a completely normal day until about 2:30 p.m. I was a sophomore in high school. I went to school, went about my usual business with my friends, went to the various clubs I was involved with during lunch, and carpooled home with my neighbor. But something about today was very, very different. Have you ever had that feeling where the air around you suddenly changes, where you don't know what's quite happened yet, but your body just feels like the universe could swallow you up in a second? That's the feeling I had when I got out of my car and walked towards my house that day. Because even though I didn't know what had happened yet, somehow I knew that everything was about to change. But what I didn't know was how my inability to deal with that change was going to affect me for much longer. What met me when I walked into my house was my mom and dad sitting on the couch, in tears. They shared the news with me that my Uncle Dave, my mom's brother, had passed from suicide the night before. Unbeknownst to my family, my uncle had suffered from serious depression for years. He lived out in LA while the rest of us lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, but I will always remember him as one of the most impactful adults on my childhood. He had a Robin Williams-esque personality, and as a kid, I cannot even describe the excitement that I would feel when he would come to visit. He would often fly to Raleigh on Christmas Eve and practically pull an all-nighter to be up with my siblings and I for Christmas morning. He was one of those people where, when we'd walk down the stairs and see the presents under the tree, we weren't sure if we were supposed to be more excited that Santa had come or that Dave was going to be here for the next 3 weeks. I say all of this to say that my uncle was someone who was very special in my life. I will always remember him as someone I looked up to, someone who encouraged me to follow my dreams, and someone who was so intentional, caring, and fun to be around. So naturally, finding out that someone you always thought would be in your wedding and would be your #1 supporter forever has not only passed, but taken their own life, is hard to believe. And when my parents told me the news, all I could do was sit there and blink at them. No tears, no crying, no asking God why. Just silence and as little thought processing as possible. Which is later, I realized, is what sports taught me to have that reaction at age 15. As someone who's always been heavily involved in their community and as your typical type A student athlete, my schedule was packed. There wasn't much room left for grieving, for figuring myself out, or for really any deep thinking in general unless I intentionally paused my routine for it. Of course, doing that would have been admitting that I was struggling, and that was simply not on the agenda when I was trying to maintain a perfect GPA, get recruited D1, and balance all my extracurricular activities. And there were a lot of them. I maintained a dizzying schedule of class, practice, and random commitments for months, holding my delusion through a painful Christmas break where nothing felt quite right without Dave. To be clear, my family was incredibly supportive this entire time. We haven't always been the most emotionally vulnerable crew, but it was clear from the start that if I needed help, wanted to see a therapist, or wanted to talk to someone, that all of those options were available. But to be completely honest, I simply did not think I needed the help. I thought my mind-numbing days working towards my goals were serving me just fine, and if I kept up this cycle forever, I'd never have to admit that my walls were breaking at the seams and I felt like I didn't matter. I might be stuck, unable to move on forever. And I didn't understand why my family members could so openly grieve and I couldn't. I don't know if it was the eldest daughter tendencies or the hardcore athlete in me that kept me from getting there, but eventually I was forced to admit that somebody I had loved had left this world. After I found out, I carried on as usual. I proceeded to follow my typical routine for the next several weeks, months. And eventually, I had to unpack what had come to be. The next month was quiet. As I began to sort through my feelings from the last month, I started to realize that I was angry with a lot more than just soccer. I was angry at Dave, angry that he had left me and my family all broken, and had left me abusing my greatest joy and outlet, my sport, to block out all the noise. I was the fittest I'd ever been, I was the most involved I'd ever been, and I was probably the most confident I had ever been. But it was all to block out the own voices in my head telling me that I wasn't good enough, I wasn't smart enough, and I wasn't strong enough to deal with my own demons that had come out in full force since my uncle's death. 7 years later, I recognized that this was all part of me navigating grief, acceptance, and figuring out who I was. My personal struggle and Dave's story empowered me in ways I never expected. And as I leaned into my student-athlete community, I learned of similar stories. Athletes that felt the weight of the world fall on their shoulders when their name was called in the starting lineup. Athletes who would drag themselves through their daily routine, not feeling good enough for any part of it. And athletes who they themselves struggled with depression and suicidal thoughts while hiding all of it so they didn't get pulled from competition. These are the very same individuals you see signing deals with your favorite brands, competing in national championships, and winning awards right and left for not only who they are as athletes, but who they are as people. No one is immune. 73% of college students experience some sort of mental health crisis during their college years. And suicide has become the second or third leading cause of death in 15 to 24-year-olds within the past 5. Within that, 5 student athletes passed from suicide in less than 2 months early last year, shattering previous records. And according to the NCAA, there's been a 150 to 200% rise in mental health concerns post-pandemic, according to the NCAA. The highest levels ever recorded. How many more lives do we have to lose before systemic change is made? When will society realize that their idols, the athletes they place up on that pedestal, are allowed to struggle too? When will their vulnerability be seen as strength instead of weakness? And when will the fans who hide behind their screens and mock them on social media realize that these are 18 to 22-year-old kids and stop sending them death threats when they miss a free throw or don't catch the game-winning touchdown? Unfortunately, these attitudes are not only seen at the college level, but they follow these athletes into their professional careers. And even worse, many young athletes are introduced to these ideas very early on in their career in sport. Thankfully, we have a generation of athletes who are no longer satisfied to suffer in silence or sit quietly on the sidelines. Student athletes are advocating for themselves, and athletic departments are starting to listen. Professional athletes are grabbing headlines, whether it be Simone Biles or Naomi Osaka stepping out of competition, or Michael Phelps or the Dallas Cowboys' Dak Prescott holding space for intentional mental health conversations. When these athletes cite mental health as a valid reason for stepping back, they continue to push forward the idea that this is not only acceptable, but a smart and brave thing to do. Here at Charlotte, I've been lucky to work towards actionable change in this realm. In my sophomore year, when I joined the Charlotte SAC Executive Board, we launched the Greater Than the Game platform, a student-athlete wellness initiative with mental health focus and goals to increase student-athlete connectedness on campus. After a few years, this has blossomed into partnering with student government and our student section leaders to host mental health awareness games, tabling on campus and promoting mental health awareness over social media, and running Niner Fire, our student-athlete-led small group mental health initiative. Niner Fire was inspired by a similar program at Virginia Tech and is student-athlete run and led. Student athletes are placed in groups of 6 to 8 individuals across sports teams and are run through a 6-week semester programming run by one of our trained student-athlete facilitators. Leading and participating in this program has impacted me in ways that it's hard to describe. Seeing the strong football player break down about his stress off the field, or seeing the star athlete with her face plastered on every poster across campus open up about her fear for the future, it's vulnerable and it's powerful. Away from the pressures of coaches and administration, walls are breaking down, and I'm hopeful for a future where these conversations can take place in every locker room without fear of backlash. The Greater Than the Game platform is just one example of how change starts small. With over 350 schools in the NCAA Division I and hundreds more in Division II or III, there is no perfect rule change or fix at the top that's going to change this overnight. That's why seemingly small program and athlete voices are so important. To see real, meaningful change, we must start with where we are. Athlete mental health struggles are a systemic issue, one that cannot simply be fixed by attending a lecture or releasing a statement, but it is something we can continue to make progress on as we attempt to change the dialogue that surrounds us. It's a reminder that for those who are seemingly living perfect lives, there can be much more going on behind closed doors. I'm proud to say I'm part of a generation of athletes that are changing the conversation. Rather than idolizing the experience, we are living it authentically and are unafraid to point out areas of change within our community. With each tragedy that hits the news, we will hold our community a little closer, pay a little bit more attention, and hopefully take steps towards the vulnerability that athletics so desperately needs, so we can hold on to our family, our teammates, and our friends. As we move forward together, not just as athletes, but as a society, I encourage you to not only hold your community a little closer, but to also check in on yourself. I have to constantly remind myself that I am more than my resume, I am more than the number on the back of my jersey, and I am more than what got checked off my to-do list today. We all get so focused on the outcome instead of the journey. We must step back and remind ourselves what really matters. Athletes have pushed the world's mental health problems to the forefront of our conversations, as they have with so many other issues throughout time. Now it is time to combat the stigma and implement long-lasting change so that years from now, the words I am speaking are no longer relevant. I will leave you with one final reminder. You belong here. Thank you.